Walk into any museum and ask a master craftsman, someone who's spent their life working with stone, to examine the ancient artifacts on display. Watch their face carefully. You'll see something unsettling, not admiration, but confusion, sometimes even laughter. Because what the plaques tell you about how these objects were made doesn't match what the objects themselves are screaming at anyone with eyes trained to see. Take the Babalovo tub, for instance, a granite basin weighing 48 tons. We're told it was carved and polished by hand over the course of years by patient artisans with primitive tools. But look at the machining marks. Really look at them. These aren't the irregular scratches of manual labor. These are the precise, rhythmic traces of industrial manufacturing. This is machine work at a level that would challenge many modern facilities. Or consider the Alexander Column in St. Petersburg. 600 tons of solid granite shaped into a perfect geometric form. It's not a simple cylinder. It's a solid of revolution with complex curves and tapers. Any engineer will tell you there's only one way to create such an object. You need a lathe. A gigantic lathe capable of rotating hundreds of tons of stone while cutting tools shape it with mathematical precision. Try asking a modern master to create even a small-scale replica of such a column from foam or softwood using only hand tools while maintaining a perfect radius throughout. They'll refuse. They'll call it absurd. Because it is. Upon detailed examination, it becomes clear these columns aren't just decorative monuments. They're complex engineering structures whose components fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. They may have been parts of technical devices from a previous era, mechanisms whose purpose we can no longer comprehend. The technologies that existed just 200 or 300 years ago are staggering when you actually study them. We're talking about polygonal masonry, where stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons are fitted together with such precision you can't slide a razor blade between them. We're talking about methods of creating what appears to be geopolymer concrete, allowing the casting of granite and marble like we pour cement today. Sculptures carved from single pieces of stone that perfectly imitate thin veils, delicate lace, or fine fishing nets. These testify to the existence of high-precision, programmable machinery, not the genius of solitary men with hammers and chisels working by candlelight. Yet, by the end of the 19th century, this knowledge had completely vanished. The methods of working with artificial stone were forgotten. Production techniques that had created architectural marvels disappeared as if they'd never existed. A logical question forms in your mind, and you can't shake it. Where did this civilization go? The one that possessed such powerful industrial capabilities that we can barely comprehend them today. The answer likely lies in catastrophic events that occurred at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. Researchers examining this period point to traces of something resembling a global conflict. A thermonuclear war played out across the planet. The result was what we might call a nuclear winter, manifesting in the historical record as the infamous year without a summer of 1816. In English-speaking sources, this period is grimly referred to as 1800 and froze to death, when freezing temperatures destroyed crops and vegetation across the northern hemisphere. Traces of this cataclysm are imprinted on the planet's surface in the form of countless perfectly round craters, which today have filled with water and become lakes surrounded by ridges of shattered limestone. In many countries, there are hundreds of them. Even more telling is the state of the forests. In the northern hemisphere, it's practically impossible to find trees older than 200 years. Most forests either burned in a planetary war or froze during the nuclear winter that followed. Look at chronicles and the first photographs from the mid-19th century, taken in Crimea or Siberia. You'll see almost desert-like landscapes, where vegetation is only just beginning to recover. These aren't the lush, ancient forests we imagine. These are new growth, struggling back to life after something terrible. After this catastrophe, human development was thrown back to the level of feudal society. The survivors had to relearn the simplest technologies, gradually working their way up to coal and steam power. Our current civilization is merely a shadow of what came before. We are children playing on the ruins of giants, mistaking their playground equipment for mountains and their industrial waste for natural wonders. We can't prove the superiority of our predecessors through their equipment because it was scrapped or melted down during periods of chaos and recovery. But the evidence lies literally beneath our feet. Highly developed civilization would have required access to the entire periodic table, which means massive industrial-scale mining of natural resources. To see the truth, you only need to apply a simple method of observation to architecture. Up to a certain point in history, buildings were constructed from perfectly cut limestone blocks with joints so tight you couldn't slide a razor blade between them. The first floors of such buildings are now often buried several meters underground, a phenomenon observed in cities all over the world. Then, suddenly, the quality of masonry dropped sharply. This isn't progress. This is degradation. This is the mark of a civilization that lost its technology and had to start over from scratch. The scale of limestone mining in the past was absolutely staggering. What are called cave cities today, places tourists visit and guides explain as ancient dwellings, are actually old quarries. The deep ruts cut into stone plateaus, which are attributed to the heavy traffic of noble families' carts, tell a different story to anyone who understands machinery. How many millions of times would a wooden cart have to pass over the same spot to carve a groove knee-deep into solid rock? It's absurd. These are traces of heavy mining equipment, machinery that hauled away stone when it existed in a different state, or equipment that possessed weight and power capable of deforming solid rock under its passage. Here's a thought experiment that puts everything in perspective. Take a modern stone quarry with its smooth walls and rectangular excavations. Transport it 10,000 years into the future and subject it to wind and water erosion. The result will be indistinguishable from what we call the Crimean cave cities today. Smoothed corners, crumbled vaults, picturesque ruins. These are just the effects of time on abandoned industrial facilities. But the evidence isn't limited to surface observations. Underground, there are facts that can't be explained away by erosion. Crimea is riddled with thousands of kilometers of catacombs. The volume of excavation is absolutely mind-boggling. Officially, we're told that stone was mined here with hand saws, starting from the time of the ancient Greeks. But when you descend into these dungeons and actually look at the walls and ceilings, you find something that doesn't fit that story. You find distinct traces of circular saws, not chaotic chips from pickaxes, smooth rhythmic marks of machine cutting. The thickness of the cuts is about 4 millimeters. The diameter of the cutting discs, judging by the radius of the arcs left when the tool stopped, reached 2 meters. Think about that. 2-meter circular saw blades cutting through solid limestone. No human being is capable of rotating a 2-meter disc by hand with the speed and precision required to slice stone like butter. This is industrial machinery. This is mass production on a scale that makes our modern quarries look quaint. The Inkerman quarry demands special attention. Preserved images from the late 19th century show a colossal cut through a hill, about 100 meters wide and 80 meters high. In the vertical walls of this giant man-made gorge, enormous niches are visible, later adapted for housing or warehouses. At the foot of these walls lie mountains of fine limestone chips and substandard debris, typical production waste that over time became overgrown with forest and began to be perceived as natural slopes. During the Second World War, these giant excavations were used as ready-made bunkers where trucks could drive in freely. Hospitals and entire factories operated inside them. But we're told they were carved by monks with chisels. The manipulation of consciousness lies in the substitution of concepts. What we call picturesque canyons and valleys are often the results of extracting millions of tons of rock. The White Rock Formation in Belogorsk, the valleys of the Bakhchisarai region, these are quarry walls. The rivers flowing along the bottom of these gorges didn't carve them out over millions of years through erosion. The water simply took the path of least resistance after mining machinery did away layers of rock and opened up underground aquifers. A mountain range standing in the path of a river acts as a natural dam. The river will always go around it unless someone artificially cuts a passage through it. And this is exactly what we observe. Giant cuts through mountain ranges, passed off as the patient work of modest streams over geological timescales. The impressive scale of mining in Crimea, where there seems to be not a single cubic meter of untouched bedrock, forces you to think about the global picture. If such intensive processing of the subsoil was carried out on this tiny peninsula, what happened on the rest of the planet? Crimea is just a dot on the map. It's logical to assume that whoever was responsible for this didn't limit their appetite to one small region. To assess the true scale of what was done to Earth, we need to look from above. where familiar mountains and gorges will appear in a completely different and frightening light. If we examine our planet not as a nature preserve, but as an object of engineering analysis, the romantic veil falls away, revealing a disturbing industrial reality. We're used to admiring the grandeur of mountain ranges and the depth of canyons, considering them masterpieces sculpted by wind and water over millions of years. But there's another way to look at them, a way based on comparing these geological formations with the results of modern mining machinery. Compare the profile of a quarry developed by a bucket wheel excavator with some famous natural landmarks. The resemblance isn't just noticeable, it's shocking in its precision. Modern bucket wheel excavators are industrial giants capable of tearing into rock and soil, leaving behind specific geometric patterns. They remove material in tiers, forming stepped structures. They often move in arcs, leaving characteristic semicircular cuts. Now, mentally magnify these traces hundreds or thousands of times and transport yourself to the most remote corners of the planet. Greenland, Antarctica, Svalbard, places that are officially considered almost untouched by human activity until very recently. Study the mountain ranges of these regions, the Watkins Mountains, the Transantarctic Mountains. You'll see those same painfully familiar industrial patterns. Enormous semicircular excavations, perfectly smooth terraces, walls that look as if they were sliced by a giant knife. Official science tells us Antarctica was only discovered in 1820. Yet its terrain preserves traces of barbaric exploitation that must have occurred long before the first polar explorers arrived. The mountains look as if they were gutted, with everything valuable extracted, leaving only an empty shell. The same applies to Mount Kailash in Tibet, a sacred peak that inspires awe in pilgrims. Its pyramidal stepped shape is considered a holy wonder, but to a mining specialist, it looks like a typical spoil heap or outlier formed by tiered excavation. The height of over 6,500 meters makes the use of modern equipment there impossible. But who said their machines were similar to ours or had the same limitations? The most striking example of global deception is the Grand Canyon in the United States. Millions of tourists are told a beautiful story about the Colorado River, which supposedly carved this massive gorge over millions of years through simple water erosion. But if you actually examine the structure of the canyon, this theory crumbles immediately. The river is a thin thread at the bottom of a gigantic abyss. Water erosion creates V-shaped profiles. It smooths corners. It changes channels chaotically, wandering back and forth. The Grand Canyon demonstrates a clear, organized structure with right angles, straight walls, and geometric precision, as if someone systematically cut the rock away in massive chunks. The walls of the canyon bear traces of mechanical impact that resemble the work of disc saws or rotary cutting mechanisms of absolutely cyclopean proportions. This isn't a riverbed carved by patient water. This is an excavated space, a giant quarry where mining was conducted on an industrial scale beyond anything our civilization could accomplish. A similar picture emerges all over the world. Many U.S. national parks, Goblin Valley, Canyonlands, are essentially exhausted mines that have been cynically rebranded as natural monuments. Nature doesn't create straight lines and perfect geometric shapes. It tends toward chaos, toward smoothing and irregularity. But here we see strict order, smooth walls, straight corridors, stepped amphitheaters. This is an industrial signature left by machinery that makes our largest excavators look like children's toys. The beings or forces that carved up these continents possessed equipment that, judging by the scale of the cuts, surpassed our capabilities by orders of magnitude. They removed entire mountain ranges as easily as we scrape butter off bread. The realization that Earth is a giant mine fundamentally changes your perception of reality. We don't live on a pristine planet. We live on a processed object, an industrial site that's been thoroughly exploited. But if mountain ranges and canyons are the places where rock was actively removed, sliced away in layers and chunks, a logical question emerges. What remains after the top layer of a planet, hundreds of meters thick, is completely stripped away? When a planetary-scale excavator finishes its work and moves on, it leaves behind a flat, lifeless platform. And the truly frightening part is that we see these platforms every day on our maps without even suspecting what they represent. We have names for them. We call them deserts. The most disturbing part of this investigation begins when we shift our attention from the vertical walls of canyons to horizontal expanses. If we imagine the work of rotary excavators systematically removing rock layer by layer, it becomes obvious that the end result would be a perfectly flat platform, cleared of everything, right down to bedrock. Now look at a world map. Pay attention to those zones marked in yellow and brown, designated as deserts. Compare these two mental images. The conclusion is shocking in its simplicity. The planet's greatest deserts aren't quirks of climate. They're the floors of giant, exhausted quarries. The scale of soil removal in these zones defies comprehension from any normal human perspective. It's as if a planetary-scale mining operation worked methodically across vast territories, removing the upper fertile layer along with all vegetation, soil, and life, down to depths of hundreds of meters. Huge territories across Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Iran, are devoid of fertile soil, not simply because there's insufficient rainfall. The geometry of the landscape itself suggests that a colossal layer of earth was sliced off these regions entirely. The plateaus and depressions in Kazakhstan, for example, show clear boundaries where the machinery apparently stopped work. We see elevated areas that are remnants of the former surface level, and huge lowlands that have been leveled like tabletops, which we now call deserts. This is especially visible in Monument Valley in the United States. Those iconic red rock buttes rising from the middle of a flat desert plain aren't the result of wind erosion selectively wearing away softer rock. These are what geologists call witnesses, sections of rock deliberately left behind to mark the original volume of deposits. The tops of these formations show the level at which the ground surface existed before mining operations began. The entire space between them was scooped out, hauled away, processed, leaving only the bare stone foundation exposed to the elements. A similar picture emerges in the Namib Desert, across Egypt, and in the red deserts of Australia. These are territories that have been scraped down to zero, where soil is completely absent, and the surface consists of bare bedrock or thin layers of sedimentary deposits. Some of these enormous excavated pits subsequently filled with water, transforming into seas and lakes whose origins perplex hydrologists who study them. The Sea of Azov, for example, fits perfectly into the theory of a flooded quarry. Its bottom is flat as a table. The maximum depth doesn't exceed 15 meters, which is completely uncharacteristic for natural tectonic depressions. If we could drain the Sea of Azov, we'd see a typical quarry floor, a platform on which massive excavators once operated. There's a theory that thorium was extracted from this region, which is supported by the presence of radioactive sands around the Azov area. The Aral and Caspian Seas also bear the hallmarks of artificially created basins. When we examine satellite imagery of Earth, we see that vast portions of land are colored in yellow and orange tones. These are the colors of exposed subsoil, of bedrock laid bare. We've been conditioned to think that deserts are natural ecosystems, formed by climate patterns and geological processes over immense time scales. But terrain analysis suggests the opposite. Deserts are anthropogenic. They appeared as the direct result of long-term, predatory industrial activity by a highly developed civilization. Whether this was planned resource extraction by the inhabitants of a previous world, or barbaric exploitation after the planet was captured by an external force, the result is the same. The fertile skin of Earth was peeled away, and the exposed flesh of the planet dried out and died under the sun. However, any industrial process of extracting minerals inevitably obeys the law of conservation of mass. If you remove billions of tons of ore from the ground, it doesn't simply vanish. Mining always consists of two stages: obtaining the valuable concentrate you want and disposing of the waste rock you don't. If deserts, seas, and canyons represent the extraction sites, those giant holes carved into the body of the Earth, then somewhere there must be corresponding mountains of waste material equal to them in volume. And here's where the picture becomes truly disturbing. We look at the landscape around us with admiration. We photograph majestic peaks and cone-shaped mountains. We don't even suspect that what we're actually looking at are toxic waste dumps from enrichment operations, material that ancient industrialists simply piled up and abandoned. Any industrial activity, especially mining conducted on a planetary scale, follows the relentless logic of material balance. If we accept that giant canyons and deserts are sites of excavation, we must ask, where did the billions of tons of waste go? It's not enough to simply mine ore. It must be processed, enriched, with valuable materials separated from worthless rock. At modern mining facilities, this creates enormous spoil heaps and tailings, ponds. If we apply this same process to the past, we should expect to find artificial mounds of absolutely colossal size somewhere on Earth's surface. And they're right there in front of us. We're just trained to call them by different names: volcanoes, hills, picturesque mountain peaks. Look at the structure of a typical coal mine spoil heap. For example, in the Donbass region, it's a cone-shaped mountain of loose material. Inside, continuous chemical reactions occur under the pressure of the heap's own mass and due to coal residues or industrial chemicals mixed in. Temperature rises. The heap begins to smolder. It produces smoke. Sometimes it even explodes, ejecting hot gases and ash into the air. Now compare this description with the behavior of Vesuvius in Italy. We're told it's a volcano, a natural window into the fiery depths of Earth's mantle. But if you actually look into the caldera of Vesuvius, you don't see granite walls melted by ascending magma, which would be characteristic of a genuine tectonic breakthrough. The walls consist of layered, loose material that you could dig through with an ordinary shovel. This is the classic structure of an artificial spoil heap. Its eruptions aren't the wrath of geological forces or tectonic activity. They're the result of excess gas pressure accumulated inside from chemical combustion of industrial waste. This hypothesis explains the nature of many iconic peaks around the world. Klyuchevskaya Sopka in Kamchatka, a nearly perfect cone almost 5 kilometers high, Mount Fuji in Japan, Mount Taranaki in New Zealand. All of them possess suspiciously regular geometric shapes, characteristics specifically associated with engineered structures. Geology doesn't work with rulers. It creates chaos, irregularity, the products of erosion and tectonic shifting over vast timescales. But here we see uniformity. We see standard dump designs repeated across the planet. The eruptions from these so-called volcanoes, the flowing lava, may actually be waste rock that's melted during internal exothermic reactions, mixed with chemical reagents from ancient processing facilities. Even the famous chocolate hills in the Philippines, more than 1,000 identical cones scattered across a vast territory, look far more like systematic dumping operations than any whim of nature. Another deeply uncomfortable question concerns the origin of sand itself. We accept as normal that enormous masses of sand accumulate in the centers of continents, thousands of kilometers from any ocean. But why? Sand, chemically speaking, is silicon dioxide, quartz. In the mining industry, the ore enrichment process often requires crushing rock into fine dust to increase surface area contact with chemical reagents. After the valuable metals are extracted, what remains is waste material, quartz sand. If you examine a world map, you'll notice that sandy deserts are positioned adjacent to major excavation zones. The Great Sand Deserts of Nevada sit next to the Grand Canyon. The sands of Central Asia and the Middle East surround gutted mountain systems. All this sand may be nothing more than waste from enrichment operations, the processed sludge that was no longer useful. It was simply dumped into lowlands or used to fill exhausted quarries when mining moved elsewhere. The abundance of sand in river valleys finds a logical explanation through this lens. Waste was dumped into rivers, and the current carried it downstream along the channel. That's why river sand often consists almost exclusively of quartz, rather than containing minerals from the rock formations the river actually flows through. This is the trash trail of an industrial civilization. The colored mountains in China and Peru, geological formations that tourists photograph and admire, represent an even more sinister reality. Their bright, unnatural colors, vivid reds, yellows, turquoise, testify to high concentrations of chemical compounds. This isn't natural beauty shaped by patient erosion. These are toxic dumps, where processed ores, soaked in industrial reagents, lie exposed in distinct layers. Walking through these areas without protective equipment may actually be dangerous to your health, but tourists aren't informed of this. Routes are carefully laid along designated paths through contaminated zones. The majestic picture of nature that we've been taught to see crumbles away, giving way to a grim industrial panorama. Mountains aren't ancient geological formations. They're piles of industrial waste. Volcanoes aren't windows into Earth's molten interior. They're burning refuse heaps. Sand isn't the product of patient erosion. It's chemical tailings. The entire surface of the planet has been dug up, processed, chewed through, and discarded. Earth isn't the pristine cradle of humanity that we imagine. It's a giant, exhausted mine where practically no untouched natural space remains. This puzzle has come together, and the image it reveals is frightening in its implications. But what does this knowledge mean for us, for those who live here and now? We're building our cities on top of someone else's industrial waste, completely unaware that our civilization might be nothing more than a temporary caretaker at an abandoned facility. The realization that our planet is essentially a giant, nearly exhausted quarry leads to an inevitable and deeply unsettling conclusion. All of our history, all of our achievements, our conflicts, our grand ambitions, it's all just activity on a dump site left behind by a far more powerful force. We're like ants that have colonized an abandoned factory. We use debris from old structures. We melt down rusted parts and components. We take pride in learning to extract tiny amounts of resources from the waste piles that previous owners considered worthless trash. We aren't the masters of Earth. We're a parasitic civilization, surviving on leftovers from someone else's table, living on toxic byproducts from industrial enrichment operations that we've poetically renamed as soil and sand. Looking into the future through this lens becomes even grimmer. If you want to see the final destination on our trajectory, you don't need to guess or build complex mathematical models. You only need to look through a telescope at our planetary neighbor, Mars. The red planet is apparently a visual demonstration of what happens to a celestial body when resource extraction is brought to its ultimate logical conclusion. Mars is a quarry that's been completely mined out, worked down to its foundation. Its atmosphere has been stripped away. Water has evaporated or been extracted. The surface is covered with a thick layer of oxidized dust, rust remaining after total processing of everything the planet once contained. The giant volcanoes of Mars, formations like Olympus Mons, are those same spoil heaps, just far more massive than anything on Earth, testifying that industrial operations there functioned at maximum capacity until they had consumed everything available. This perspective forces us to completely rethink the purpose of humanity itself. People come and go, states rise and fall, nations conflict and disappear into historical oblivion. But the process of matter extraction and processing never stops. Perhaps our biological form of life is just a temporary phase, necessary to maintain the quarry during a period of reduced operations or staged closure. We're fragile. We need oxygen, liquid water, specific temperature ranges. We depend on a biosphere that we're systematically destroying in our attempts to replicate the technological achievements of our predecessors. But the logic of industrial development suggests the next inevitable step. We are building, with our own hands and with almost maniacal determination, the entities that will replace us. We're talking about the creation of artificial intelligence and self-replicating robotic systems. Silicon-based life forms, which we're desperately trying to bring into existence, will become the ideal workers for the final stage of planetary extraction. They won't require an atmosphere. They won't fear background radiation. They won't need liquid water or narrow temperature bands. They'll function effectively in conditions identical to Mars, completing what their creators, or those who stood above their creators, didn't finish or chose to abandon. We'll pass into history, having fulfilled our function as a biological catalyst for the machine of eternal extraction. There's an old expression that, in the context of this theory, takes on a sinister and literal meaning. God's mills grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. This isn't about divine justice or cosmic karma. This is about the relentless mechanical process of transforming everything that exists into processed material. The millstones of this universal mill turn slowly and steadily, grinding mountains into sand, oceans into salt flats, and entire civilizations into thin cultural layers buried under waste. The wheel moves forward inexorably, and absolutely everything will eventually pass through it. We stand at the threshold of understanding that our role in the cosmos may be purely utilitarian, purely functional. Earth has already surrendered its most valuable resources. The giant silicon trees of a previous era have been harvested. Precious metals have been exported. The fertile topsoil has been stripped away. We exist in the final phase of a project's closure, in what might be called environmental remediation, though it apparently doesn't include restoring the planet to any pristine state. Most likely, we're headed for the fate that already befell Mars, to become a cold, lifeless monument to the greatest act of planetary theft in this star system's history. A dead world where wind will eternally drive quartz sand across the bottoms of empty ocean basins, slowly covering the last traces of our brief presence. And only silent spoil heaps, the formations we mistook for majestic volcanic peaks, will remain as eternal monuments to this vast industrial operation. The process isn't complete. The millstones continue their patient work, utterly indifferent to the fate of whatever temporary inhabitants occupy the surface of the material being processed.